Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about Chris Claremont's X-Men. So, I can't really think of a writer who's probably had a bigger impact on my life than Chris Claremont. He's always been a big deal to me. I've read his run of X-Men, the entire run, several times. It's very long. My dad had all the issues. I read through them, I think the last time was 2003, but a lot of my childhood was reading and rereading Chris Claremont's run of X-Men, and it was something that was really important to me. So when I heard there was a documentary about Chris Claremont's run on X-Men, I of course had to see it. And this was made before as Comics in Focus, Chris Claremont's X-Men, in 2013, and I thought it was just on straight on DVD, but apparently it was on Vimeo on demand. I didn't know that at the time, thus I would have seen this earlier, but now it has been re-released in a longer version and just called Chris Claremont's X-Men. And basically this documentary really just goes through the whole history of him writing X-Men and the various artists that worked with him, from Dave Cockrum to John Byrne to Paul Smith to John Romita Jr. to Mark Silvestri to Jim Lee, and probably someone I'm leaving out, and specifically his work with Bill Sienkiewicz on New Mutants. As someone who's reread all those comics countless times, I thought this was a really great documentary in that. And I love watching Robert Kirkman's Comics That Changed the World, or whatever comics is, the AMC Robert Kirkman comic book documentary show. Fuck, that's called. Is something I enjoy quite a bit, and I love watching documentaries on comic books, partly to be kind of informed, but I guess I knew a lot of this. There's some parts I didn't know, particularly kind of the end of Claremont's run on X-Men, which I knew wasn't handled very well by Marvel. I think everyone would agree with that. But going through, like, particularly his interviews with Louise Simonson and Ann Nasanti, and an interview with Jim Shooter, and almost seems a little reluctant to be interviewed, as well as trying to, like, not make himself look like too big of an asshole, regardless of where you fall on Jim Shooter. But it does give you kind of an interesting behind the scenes. But I think what I liked hearing about it, and what I like about Claremont's run, is it's kind of ahead of its time. And I think now the writing he did, even though I don't think you could be a writer on a comic book for 17 years and totally change it completely and make it your own, in a way. I mean, he's kind of unique in the fact that he took something like the X-Men and changed it so much and had such a big impact on it that even Stan Lee himself, who helped create X-Men with Jack Kirby, has even said it's more of Claremont's book than it ever was his, which, if you know anything about the Stan Lee Jack Kirby thing, is a pretty big thing for him to actually say. He's not too into giving credit to people, but he actually did. I have heard him say that before. What Claremont did with his flow and his flow through story, and they say this in it, and I think I've thought this before too, this is so serialized that by the time you get to the end of the run, it's like almost the treat for going through all those issues. By the end, they're in the Australian outback, and it's really weird, and Storm's running the X-Men and all this stuff, and I really love that run, frankly. I've always really liked towards the end when it gets weird, you know, with the Siege Perilous, although I think that's earlier, kind of the flow of that run and seeing, you know, where the X-Men were towards the end of it and how far he was expanding upon that and how much he was doing with those characters. And although I will agree, Rob Liefeld actually has a point, like there's a part where the female X-Men go to the mall and stuff like that, and that maybe isn't like the craziest, you know, it felt like maybe they needed something to change a little bit, which I guess I agree in terms of that issue specifically, but I still think, you know, when they get with Gateway and the Australian outback, I sort of like that period, and it's kind of, I always sort of wonder what X-Men could have been if Claremont could have continued on his own kind of thing. And it seems like the editor, Bob Harris, who came off after Ann Nesenti, was much more commercial minded and made him change things, and had a lot to do with X-Men #1, and, you know, that being the best-selling comic of all time with 8 million copies. And then Claremont left writing X-Men completely a couple issues later, which was very sad. They say that there isn't a note in any of the comics. There was a small note in X-Men 3, because I remember that. There was a small note. They say that in the documentary, but that is actually not true. Was it a worthwhile note? Was it a note that it should have been? No. But it was so crappy, but there was actually a notice in there. BTW. Claremont had a big impact on my life because he actually appeared at my local comic book store when I was about, say, 8 or 9, around there. And my dad, my sister, and I all went, and he kind of hung out with us for a little bit because nobody showed up, oddly enough. And it was right after his run on X-Men had ended, and I think it just wasn't promoted enough, but nobody showed up. He was there to promote a book, and he was very nice to me, and he explained kind of how his favorite character was actually Kitty Pryde, and he kind of talked about why he liked writing women and how other characters are more interesting than, just Wolverine. And it was kind of a seismic shift in terms of how I understood narrative, how I understood that other characters beyond, Wolverine could be cool, which I think some people never get over. And he really, made me think about that, and made me think about particularly a character like Danny Moonstar, who's one of my favorite X-Men characters, particularly in his New Mutants run with Bill Sienkiewicz, and particularly the Demon Bear arc, which is, I think, probably one of the best things he's written, which is really saying something, but I think it's probably the best New Mutants comic. That goes without saying, I guess. Just hearing him talk about writing and answering all our questions and being just generally nice to, two little kids, it kind of made me always have a lot of respect for him, because that was really, really cool of him to have that experience. And it made me really look up to Chris Claremont and really take his work seriously. And there were parts in this documentary, particularly in the end, where he talks about writing and the importance of trying to do your best when you're creating something, and how almost, I guess, when a fan comes up to you and has kind of a passionate reaction, that your work should be good enough to deserve that kind of attention. Not that I'm recognized very often or anything. I actually sort of agree with that, because it's like, it's not, you don't want fan attention for the sake of having attention or someone like you. That part's sort of nice too, but I think to me it's almost like, well, you made something and someone has such a great reaction to it that they want to talk to you later, that they have that passion in you, that they want to be able to speak to you and say something to you. There's some words he says at the end, and I almost wish there could be a documentary entirely about Chris Claremont and him talking about writing and him talking about life, because I would be fine with Chris Claremont's thoughts. I would see that movie too. So I was a little like, going to probably like this movie anyway. But I think Paul Meany, who has directed other things like The Image Revolution, which I've previously seen, and other comic book documentaries, which I haven't seen, my biggest problem is he does this thing with a bunch of cosplayers between them to show a cosplayer in a Phoenix outfit, a cosplayer in a White Queen outfit, a cosplayer Wolverine, all this crap. If you go to conventions, that's cool. And I think people who dress up, that's a talent and a skill. But that's a talent and a skill to be able to look that much like a certain character. And I know they spent a lot of time on that. It looks like they, rented out a studio to shoot those things. I didn't really think it really worked within the documentary. I found it kind of jarring, and often felt rather sort of cheap, because you're like, well, who are these people? You needed this in here to make it feel more real. I would have been fine with comic pages in between them. It seems like if you know who these cosplayers are, it's kind of cool for you. That's neat. But as a narrative thing, it's like, here, let's hear about how, women in comics are important, and then let's see this woman dressed as Storm, move her hand around and crap. And you're like, I mean, that's cool that she looks like Storm, but, I would just like to see, cool pictures of Storm. I love the art in those comics. I would be happy just reading them. I don't know if that was in the comics info. I would actually like if someone in the comics has seen the original version and the newer version, if they could tell me the differences. I would actually be very interested in that. So, write a long ass comment in that regard, and I would be very cool with that. Not that you can write any comment you want, I'm just saying in general, I'm interested in that subject. So if you know anything, please let me know. That was kind of my biggest problem with it. I will say that there was sort of a narrator, but it feels like often what I remember more about it is the interviews, which it almost felt like he got the interviews and let the interviews kind of make the movie, and then when he could just kind of have them talk and have them tell the story, sometimes the narrator would reiterate certain things, and the narrator is kind of almost completely forgotten. I'm not exactly sure who was the narrator. You're almost more focused on Louise Simonson and Nachetti and Chris Claremont and the writer of The Secret History of Marvel Comics or whatever, that book, which was pretty good, which I think I have somewhere. and some of the artists and things like that. Not John Byrne, which is predictable. Louise Simonson, Ann Nocenti, and Chris Claremont seem to be kind of the focus. Obviously, Chris Claremont's the focus of it because it's like about him. I really liked this movie quite a bit. For me personally, Chris Claremont's always going to be a big deal. So I guess, you know, if you are like, should I see this if I don't know anything about his involvement in X-Men or don't care about X-Men, I don't know why you're watching a review of this documentary at this point. That seems weird to me. But I think with Chris Claremont's X-Men, if you like X-Men a lot, there have been other writers who made impacts on X-Men, certainly Grant Morrison. For me, this documentary, I think if you are interested in a documentary about Chris Claremont's run on X-Men, this isn't a bad documentary. I think it's actually rather good. It's just the cosplay thing that sort of sucks. Like, I think I got some kind of insight into how much fun it was to write at Marvel, what it was like in the X-Men offices, what it was like between Chris Claremont and his various devotees, and how people would check with him, and kind of like he seemed to be like kind of an advisor on all the X-Men stuff and how much involvement he had and everything like that. And that was actually fairly interesting. It was sad to hear like Bob Harris was against him, even though I actually sort of really like the Jim Lee, Chris Claremont stuff, that kind of run of X-Men. It seems like, I think it's probably more of Bob Harris's fault. Jim Lee was just, you know, very successful and they wanted to appease him more, and I don't know how much of the fights were between Jim Lee and Chris Claremont. It seems like there weren't, but it seems like they sort of get along. I don't really know. Sort of sad to hear because I loved those particular issues, that was kind of the beginning of the end of Chris Claremont, unfortunately. If you are interested in Chris Claremont and you're interested in the X-Men, I actually highly recommend this documentary. And if you're interested in comic books specifically, and it's a major history of comic books, if you're ever like, how did the X-Men become so successful? Who was the author and what was the storyline that made them so successful? Well, guess what? It's actually Chris Claremont. If you've ever wondered how the X-Men became the big deal that they are, it's because of Chris Claremont's run. You know, it was just kind of a small book that nobody cared about, and then he came along and made it into the juggernaut it was. And it's interesting to hear him talk about character, how he cared about character, how he changed certain things. I think there's a lot of what he did in his run that probably would appeal to people who like things like peak TV, and certainly how storytelling is now. His stuff kind of works really well within that, and hearing him talk about how he wanted to do massive crossovers, but also have small stories with Storm and things like that. They're all things I keep reading about throughout when I was a kid, and reading interviews with him and rereading these comics over and over again. And I'm probably due to reread his entire run again at some point in my life, or if not several more times, because I love that run so much. And it's probably just one of those things that I will just always really love. And I think it's a really great run, maybe one of the greatest runs probably in comics history. And just something that, you know, I know some people don't like Chris Claremont, some people don't like his prose and so forth, but it's always held a special place in my heart, and I've always appreciated the kind of artistic achievement that he was able to achieve with his X-Men run, and how he was able to evolve those characters and push them to the places he was able to put them in towards the end of his run. I think is just like sort of an epic and prolific achievement that I don't think very few people in terms of writing and artistry ever really get to do, and he really did it, and it's just sort of an amazing achievement to behold. And I think it's worth kind of having a documentary about such an amazing epic run that Chris Claremont did with the X-Men. So if you have seen Chris Claremont's X-Men and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.